Imagine watching a murder and clapping. That's exactly what happened in 1930. A town gathered under a tree not to mourn, but to celebrate the death of two innocent men. And the most terrifying part? No one was ever held accountable. You won't believe how deep this goes. It was buried in the back of an old wooden drawer, under stacks of brittle yellowed papers and the dusty scent of time. The kind of drawer no one opened unless they were looking for something they didn't really want to find. I wasn't looking for it. I was just cleaning out my grandfather's attic. But there it was, tucked between a faded newspaper and a cracked leather journal, an 8-sten black and white photo. No caption, no name, just an image that made my heart slam against my chest like it was trying to escape. Two black men hanging from a tree. Their bodies swung lifelessly. One of them still had his shirt half torn. The other head, tilted at a brutal angle, seemed almost peaceful in death. But it wasn't their faces that haunted me the most. It was the crowd beneath them, dozens of white men and women, standing, pointing, smiling. A few young boys stared up at the bodies with morbid fascination. One teenage girl had her arm looped around her boyfriend's, her finger extended toward the corpses as if she were pointing out a constellation. Another man, shirt sleeves rolled up, leaned back with a cigarette in his mouth, and the smirk of a man watching fireworks on the 4th of July. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a celebration. My fingers trembled. I flipped the photo over. Someone had scribbled in pencil, light but legible, Marion, Indiana, August 7, 1930. That was it. No other note. No explanation. But I didn't need one. I had read about lynchings in textbooks, heard the numbers. Thousands of black men and women killed by mobs during the Jim Crow era. But no amount of reading could prepare me for that photograph, because this wasn't just history. This was a punch to the gut, a scream in the dark, a truth too ugly to look away from. I sat down, still holding it, as the attic creaked beneath me. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. That photo felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. And the question that wouldn't leave my head was this: why are they smiling? How do you smile with death hanging over you? How do you bring your children to watch? That's what got me. Not the lynching, horrific as it was, but the normalization of it, the casual cruelty, the picnic smiles, the Sunday best outfits. Someone had taken this photo on purpose, framed it perfectly, caught the angle, the lighting, the mood, and then printed it, probably handed it out, maybe even sold it like it was something to be proud of. The deeper I stared, the more questions rose like bile. Who were the men in the tree? What did they do or not do that made them targets? Who took the photo? And why was it tucked away in my grandfather's attic? I remembered stories about him, how he'd marched with King in '65, how he taught at a black college, even when it wasn't respectable. But he'd never mentioned this photo. Never said a word about Marion, Indiana. Maybe he couldn't, or maybe he was trying to forget. But now it was in my hands, and I couldn't unsee it. That's the thing about some images. They don't need words. They don't need stories. They are the story. And that photo, it was more than just two men in a tree. It was a mirror held up to a country that preached liberty but practiced horror, a mirror to a justice system that stepped aside when the mob came knocking, a mirror to people who smiled at the worst version of themselves and called it normal. I placed the photo gently back on the floor, took out my phone, snapped a picture, because history buried is history repeated. And some things, some truths, are too important to stay in a drawer, even if they hurt, especially if they hurt. It started with a whisper, like most lynchings did. One girl, one accusation, one town, already heavy with suspicion and silence. The newspapers would later write it in hushed italics, an alleged assault. But in Marion, Indiana, that word alleged never stood a chance. By sundown on August 7, 1930, the streets were pulsing with a sick anticipation. Church bells still rang, storefronts still glowed, but everyone knew something was coming, and no one dared stop it. They were only 17, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, arrested that afternoon, dragged into the Grant County Jail. By evening, the rumors had become gospel. They attacked a white girl, someone said. No trial, said another. Not for them. They deserve what's coming. The jail sat like a fortress in the center of town. Brick walls, iron bars. But even the strongest lock means nothing when the town turns into a weapon. It was around 8:30 p.m. when the first rock hit the door, then another, then fists, then hammers. The sheriff, Tom Jones, stood inside, sweaty palms shaking, radio in one hand, heart pounding like a drum beat. He knew what was happening. They all did. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Outside, the crowd had swollen into a mob over 1,000 strong. Men in overalls, women in summer dresses, boys holding their fathers' hands, girls eating peaches. And in the center, holding a thick rope, was Jack Duval, local mechanic, known for fixing trucks and breaking men. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence was a command. Inside the jail, Thomas could hear the walls breathing. He clutched the edge of his cot, knuckles white, chest heaving. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't what they said he was. In the next cell, Abram paced like a caged animal, his jaw clenched. Blood still trickled from the side of his mouth. "They're gonna kill us," he muttered. No trial, no lawyer, just rope. And in the last cell, barely 16, sat James Cameron, wide-eyed, frozen, trying to remember how to breathe. The bars rattled, a bang, then a crash. The mob poured in like fire through a broken window. Shouts, boots, screams. Thomas was the first they pulled. He didn't fight. He just asked, "Can I see my mama?" No one answered. Abram fought harder, too hard. They broke his arm first, then the other. His screams didn't stop them. They only made the crowd cheer louder. They dragged the boys through the streets barefoot, bleeding, beaten. People followed like it was a parade. And when they reached the tall maple tree in Courthouse Square, someone tossed the rope over a thick branch, tied the noose, and smiled like they were decorating a Christmas tree. Thomas went up first. His body jerked, then stilled. Someone snapped a picture. Click. The sound cut through the air like thunder. Then came Abram. One arm hung limp. He was still conscious, still begging. But the rope didn't care. As they hoisted him, he kicked. His foot struck a man in the face. That man drew a knife and carved into Abram's chest before they finished the job. His body hung beside Thomas, side by side. Dead before their time, killed not for proof, but for color. Then someone called for James, the boy, the youngest. They dragged him forward, arms flailing, face soaked in sweat and tears. And just when the noose was about to slip over his neck, a voice, loud, sharp, splitting the mob in half. "Wait, that one's innocent." No one knew who said it. No one ever stepped forward. But for some reason, the rope paused. The crowd grumbled. A few yelled, "Hang him anyway." But a strange tension took over. The moment cracked, and in that tiny crack, James slipped through. They shoved him back. Bloody, broken, but alive. He would live to tell the story, again and again, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The night didn't end there. The mob lingered. Some people brought their children closer for a better look. Others took out pocket knives and cut pieces of the boy's clothing as souvenirs. Someone plucked a button from Thomas's shirt and dropped it into her purse like a keepsake. And under the hanging bodies, someone lit a cigarette and asked, "Think they'll do another tomorrow?" Later, back at the jail, Sheriff Jones sat in his office, hands shaking, ashes from his cigar falling on the floor. He didn't stop them, didn't even try, just stared at his badge like it meant something. By midnight, the square was quiet. The crowd had gone home. The children were tucked into bed, and two bodies swung in the August breeze, telling the truth that no courtroom ever would. Decades later, that photograph would be called the most haunting image of American racism ever taken. But on that night, it was just normal. Another lynching, another town, another tree, and 1,000 smiling faces who all looked into the camera and didn't blink. The fire of Marion didn't come from torches. It came from the way justice was set ablaze. No one tried to put it out. The old man sat in a folding chair that creaked every time he shifted his weight. The summer heat pressed in from all sides, but he didn't seem to notice. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, pushing the air just enough to make the silence uncomfortable. His name was James Cameron, not the director, not a politician, just a black man from Marion, Indiana, who had lived through something no one was ever supposed to survive. He had spoken about that night dozens of times, hundreds, maybe, in churches, in schools, on news programs, and courthouse steps. But every time he told it, something in his voice cracked like it was brand new. I was sitting across from him, holding a tape recorder, heart thudding like a drumbeat I couldn't control, and he just looked at me for a long time before speaking. August 7, 1930, he said slowly. That's the day I died. Or, part of me did. His eyes didn't blink. They just stared through me like he was watching it all over again in his mind. I was 16, maybe 1/25th of a man in their eyes. He shifted in his chair, the wood groaning beneath him. They came in like a storm, 1,000 white faces, screaming, spitting. I couldn't even tell what they were saying. It was just noise, like fire hissing. He raised his hand and rubbed his neck gently, as if muscle memory still remembered the rope. They dragged Thomas out first, then Abram. I heard the screams, but I didn't see it. Not until they came for me. His voice trembled slightly now, like a window rattling in the wind. They kicked the cell door open and yanked me out. I remember my foot slipping on something wet. Later I realized it was blood. He paused. I thought of my mama, thought maybe I'd call out her name, but the sound got stuck in my throat. I was too scared to pray. I watched his hands curl into fists. They pulled me through the street. I remember seeing faces I recognized. A school teacher, the grocer who gave me penny candy, folks who used to smile at me when I walked to church. He shook his head slowly, and now they looked at me like I wasn't human. James inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling like a tired wave. They got me to the tree, the same one where Thomas and Abram were already swinging, and they threw the rope over again. At this point, he stopped. His eyes glistened. I felt the noose touch my neck, and I thought, this is it. There's nothing more. No future. No later. Just this. Then came the silence. Long. Heavy. Sacred. He looked at me, and I swear I felt the air in the room shift. But then, someone shouted. He sat up straighter. It came from the back of the crowd. A man, maybe. Or a woman. I'll never know. They yelled, "That boy's innocent!" He let that sentence hang in the air like gospel. I don't know why they listened. I don't know who that voice belonged to. But the crowd, they stopped. His voice dropped to a whisper. They pushed me back. Bloodied, broken, but breathing. A single tear traced a line down his cheek. I ran. I didn't look back. Just ran until my legs gave out. I fell in the dirt and cried like a baby. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and smiled just a little, just enough. I survived, but not by my own doing. Someone spoke up, and I lived. He leaned forward now, eyes sharp with memory. But surviving ain't the same as living, he said. You think because you're alive, it's over. But no, you carry it. Every night, every year, every time you see a tree that looks too strong. He chuckled bitterly. And for the longest time, I hated myself for living. Thomas and Abram, they didn't get that chance. Why me? I didn't answer. I couldn't. He looked away. I went back to that tree once, years later, planted a rose bush under it, not to forgive, not to forget, but to reclaim something. He stood up slowly, carefully, and walked to a bookshelf, pulled down a framed photo, not the lynching photo, a different one. It was him, standing beside Martin Luther King Jr., smiling, older, stronger, whole. I founded a museum, America's Black Holocaust Museum. Not because I wanted people to feel guilty, but because I needed them to know. He looked at me again, stern, but kind. You can't heal what you won't face. That photo, it's not just about death. It's about the silence that let it happen. I turned off the recorder, unsure of what to say. James sat back down and looked out the window. Outside, kids were riding bikes. Dogs barked. Life moved on. But in that room, time stood still. Before I left, I asked him one last question. Do you still remember the face of the person who saved you? He smiled faintly. No, but I remember the sound of their voice. He paused. Sometimes that's all it takes to save a life. Just one voice, saying no. And that's what stuck with me. Not the ropes, not the mob, not even the tree, but the power of a single voice in the face of 1,000 silent ones. James Cameron didn't survive because the system protected him. He survived because someone refused to be part of the silence. And now, because of him, we don't have to be silent either. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I knocked on her door. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, 89 years old, retired school librarian, and lifelong resident of Marion, Indiana. Her house sat on a shaded corner lot with a flagpole in the yard and wind chimes hanging from the porch. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad had ever happened. But when she opened the door and saw the photo in my hand, everything changed. Her smile faded. Her eyes dropped. And for a few seconds, she stood completely still, like time had frozen her in place. "Oh," she whispered, "you found it." I hadn't even said a word. She invited me in, poured sweet tea into ceramic mugs, and sat down in a recliner that squeaked with age. She placed the photo on her lap like it was something sacred or radioactive. Her fingers traced the edge of it. Then, very slowly, she pointed to the lower left corner. "There," she said. "That's me." A little girl in a white dress, maybe 8 or 9, blonde curls tied in ribbons, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other pointing upward toward the tree, toward the bodies. I stared at her in disbelief. "You were there?" She nodded, not proudly, not with shame, just honestly. "I was a child," she said. "I didn't know what I was looking at." She took a sip of tea. The ice clinked like nervous fingers. "My father told me we were going to see justice," she said the town was handling business. "So we walked, past the courthouse, past the bakery. I remember smelling fresh bread." "Funny how you remember the small things." She smiled faintly. Then her voice grew smaller. "I asked him if there would be fireworks. He said, something better." She looked up at me, eyes now glassy. And then we saw them. She didn't have to say who. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the photo again. "I didn't understand what they were doing," she said, "but I knew it wasn't right." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They were smiling." Her face crumpled a little. My father was smiling. She closed her eyes. I remember asking him, "Are they sleeping?" He said, "They're being taught a lesson." She paused. That lesson haunts me to this day. We sat in silence for a long time. I didn't want to press, but I had to ask, why were there children there? Why bring kids to something like that? She shook her head, as if even after all these years, she still didn't have the answer. Because it wasn't just hate, it was culture. It was passed down like Sunday clothes and family recipes. You didn't question it. You absorbed it. She looked out the window at her own quiet street. We weren't raised to see Black people as people. We were raised to see them as a warning. That sentence hit like a freight train. Eleanor stood up, slowly, and disappeared into the next room. When she returned, she was holding a shoebox filled with letters, newspaper clippings, and an old ribbon that looked like it had once been white. She pulled out a faded program. Community picnic and rally, Courthouse Square, August 7, 1930, she read aloud. It was advertised like a community event. "Bring your kids, bring your chairs, stay for the spectacle." I felt sick. They dressed it up like a picnic, she said, but it was a lynching in full daylight, a murder with an audience. She shook her head again, quietly, and we clapped. I asked her if her parents ever regretted what they'd done, what they brought her to see. She hesitated. My father never talked about it again, not once. And my mother, she used to cry when she thought I wasn't looking, but they never said, "I'm sorry." Not to me, not to anyone. She leaned forward now, eyes sharp, voice firmer. "But I am." I blinked. I spent most of my adult life trying to undo what that day put inside me. I taught at a predominantly Black elementary school. I changed the curriculum. I talked to kids about racism before it had the chance to poison them. She looked at me, defiant in her fragility. But nothing I do will ever make up for the fact that I was there, and I smiled. She reached into the shoebox again and pulled out a photo of herself as a young teacher, standing with a group of smiling Black students in front of a school chalkboard. I asked one of them once, "Do you know who James Cameron is?" She laughed softly. They said, "Yeah, he's a hero." Her eyes welled up. "And he is. Because he survived what none of us should have witnessed. And instead of hating us for it, he built a museum." She looked back down at the lynching photo, her thumb gently brushing over her younger self's face. That photo. It's not just about the victims. It's about us, the ones who watched, the ones who didn't speak. She exhaled deeply. "I see that little girl pointing in the photo, and I wish I could go back and scream, 'Don't look. Don't let this become part of you.' But I did. And it did." When I stood to leave, she followed me to the door. As I stepped outside, she touched my arm gently. "Tell them," she said, "when you share the story, don't just show the bodies, show the faces, ours, the crowd, the smiles. That's where the evil lives. That's what we have to face." I nodded. And as I walked down her driveway, I looked back once. She was still standing there, a frail woman with a haunted past, gripping a piece of paper that should never have existed. But it did. Because they smiled, and she remembered. And now, so do we. The first time Abel Mirapol saw the photo, he couldn't breathe. It was taped to a bulletin board in a teacher's lounge, an anonymous reprint with no explanation, no caption, just two black bodies hanging from a tree, and the crowd below grinning like they'd just witnessed something sacred. He stared at it for a long time, longer than anyone else in the room. While the other teachers shook their heads or turned away with casual disgust, Abel stood frozen. It wasn't just the horror. It was the silence that wrapped around it, the kind of silence that felt complicit. Abel was a Jewish school teacher in New York. He knew what hatred looked like. He'd felt it in muttered slurs, in cold stares, in the invisible wall between them and us. But this photo, this wasn't just hatred, this was ritual, this was celebration. This was death dressed up in Sunday clothes. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the faces, not the victims, but the spectators. The way they looked comfortable, entertained, like they were watching fireworks. His fingers itched for something: pen, paper, justice, anything. So he wrote. And what spilled out wasn't an essay. It wasn't an article. It was a poem. 12 lines. No title yet. Just pain. Southern trees bear strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. The words came like tears, quiet, sharp, honest. He didn't think. He didn't revise. He just bled. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. He sat there, staring at the page, hands trembling. He had never written anything like this. Months later, the poem found its way into Harlem's smoky jazz clubs and back alley gatherings. It traveled from hand to hand until it reached a woman whose voice could hold an entire room hostage. Her name was Billie Holiday. When Billie read the lyrics, she didn't speak. She just read them again, and then she folded the paper and tucked it inside her coat. She knew what it meant. She'd seen the strange fruit herself, maybe not with her eyes, but with her blood. Her father had died in a segregated hospital, refused care for being black. Her own life had been nothing but battle after battle against racism, addiction, and the weight of being a black woman in a country that preferred her voice to her truth. So when she stepped onto the stage at Cafe Society, the first integrated nightclub in New York, she didn't announce the song. She didn't even name it. She just stood there in the spotlight, eyes low, body still, as the band played soft, haunting chords in the dark. And then she sang, "Southern trees bear strange fruit." Her voice was smoke and steel, fragile, but unbreakable. The audience stopped breathing. Knives clinked against untouched plates. Glasses froze in midair. Pastoral scene of the gallant South. Every word was an accusation, every note a wound. The bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Some people looked away. Others began to cry. And a few, just a few, walked out. Because the truth Billie delivered wasn't wrapped in comfort. It wasn't polite. It wasn't digestible. It was a scream wrapped in a lullaby. Here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck. By the final line, the room had become a graveyard, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter crop. She let the silence linger, let it choke the air. Then she turned and walked off stage. No encore, no applause. Just that silence. The kind that comes after truth. The kind that can't be followed by clapping. Billie sang Strange Fruit for the rest of her life, but never easily. The song was banned from radio. Many club owners begged her to stop performing it. The FBI began monitoring her, harassing her, targeting her, but she kept singing it. Not for the fame, not for the money, but because she had no choice. The photo that birthed the song? It stayed with her, not physically, but in her lungs, her throat, her blood. Every time she sang, she hung from that tree too. And the audience. They were forced to decide, will you be part of the mob? Or will you be the one voice that says no? Back in New York, Abram eventually set his name to the poem and gave it a title, Strange Fruit. He never made much money from it. He didn't care. What mattered was that the song lived on. And it did. It became an anthem, a hymn of mourning, a blade against silence. It was played at protests, printed in pamphlets, studied in classrooms. It outlived Billie, outlived Abel, outlived the mob in Marion, Indiana. But it never stopped being relevant. Because the fruit still grows. New trees, new names, same soil. Years later, at a university lecture, someone asked a civil rights historian what song most defined the struggle. She didn't hesitate. Strange Fruit, she said, because it didn't ask to be understood. It demanded to be felt. And now, whenever that song plays, if it plays, you can feel the room shift, hearts tighten, mouths go dry. Because Strange Fruit isn't entertainment. It's a reckoning. It's a ghost. It's the photograph, set to music. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Once you feel it, you carry it. Just like we're meant to. There are moments when history whispers, and then there are moments when it roars. The photograph from Marion, Indiana Thomas and Abram hanging lifeless, while the crowd posed like it was a family picnic, didn't disappear. It didn't rot, like the bitter fruit Billie sang about. It spread, silently, relentlessly, like a secret passed between trembling hands. It made its way into newspapers, church bulletins, university libraries, anywhere people dared to tell the truth. For years, it was passed around in folded envelopes and mimeographed pamphlets. And then, one day, it landed in the hands of a woman who had already been calling out America's sins long before most dared admit they existed. Her name was Ida B. Wells, journalist, Trots crusader, lynching survivor. She didn't flinch when she saw the image. She'd seen worse. She'd buried too many names. But this photograph, this proof, this was different. This, she said, holding it up before a crowded church in Memphis, is what we must force the nation to look at. And they did. Under the shade of stained glass windows, mothers sat clutching their sons tighter than usual. Young men stared in stunned silence. Even the preachers didn't know what to say, because the photograph said everything. There's no caption, because there's no excuse, Ida said. No trial, no evidence, no justice, just rope and laughter. She called it what it was, an American ritual, sanctioned by silence, blessed by indifference. And she wouldn't let it go unanswered. Within months, the photo became the centerpiece of anti-lynching campaigns across the country. Posters plastered in black neighborhoods screamed, "This is America, are you watching?" They were sons. They were brothers. They were us. Next time, it might be you. Activist groups like the NAACP printed the image in their newsletter, The Crisis. Alongside chilling statistics, 1,134 lynchings in the last decade alone. And this is just the one we have a photo for. It became impossible to look away. And that was the point. In 1937, the NAACP launched one of its most daring public awareness campaigns to date. They rented out billboard space across the country, yes, even in the South, and posted the words, "A man was lynched yesterday." Black letters on white cloth. No names, no photos, just that sentence, day after day. Each time a body dropped, and behind those chilling words was that photo, pinned to church walls, tucked inside protest signs, carried like a scar across marches and meetings. It didn't just haunt, it mobilized. That summer, a young law student named Thurgood Marshall stood at a podium, holding the photograph before a crowd of weary activists in Baltimore. "I don't want you to look at the men in the tree," he said. "I want you to look at the people beneath them." He pointed to the smiling faces, the relaxed posture, the way no one looked away from the camera. This is not just about murder. This is about consent. This is about what happens when good people do nothing. His voice rose like a tide. This photo is our indictment, but it can also be our beginning. That moment stayed with him for the rest of his life, through courtrooms, protests, threats, and finally, all the way to the USS Supreme Court. Decades later, during the 1963 March on Washington, a banner hung behind the stage almost hidden in plain sight. It showed a black silhouette of the Marion lynching photo, overlaid with the words, "We are still hanging." As Dr. King stood to deliver his "I have a dream" speech, it flapped gently in the breeze, like a reminder of the bodies that couldn't be there to hear it. Because they had already spoken, their truth had already shouted, and the country was still catching up. Even the FBI, never eager to acknowledge systemic racism, took notice. In 1940, internal memos warned that the widespread circulation of the Marion photograph is fueling dangerous sentiment and potential unrest. Translation: people were waking up. People were angry. They weren't asking for apologies anymore. They were demanding change. And the photo? It became a weapon, silent but undeniable. You couldn't explain it away. You couldn't pretend it didn't exist. It stared right back at you. But the most powerful moment perhaps ever came not in a courtroom or a campaign, but in a middle school classroom in Chicago. A teacher named Miss Darla Freeman showed the photo to her 8th grade students. There was a moment of stunned silence. One boy pushed the image away. A girl quietly wept. Another raised his hand and asked, "Why were they so happy?" Miss Freeman didn't answer right away. Then she simply said, "Because no one ever told them not to be." She left the photo up all week, and by Friday, every student had written a letter to the boys in the tree, to the crowd, to America. One girl wrote, "If I had been there, I would have screamed until someone listened." Another wrote, "I don't want to be someone who smiles when others suffer. I want to be the voice that says stop." And that was the point. The truth doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it's a photograph taped to a classroom wall. Sometimes it's a poem. Sometimes it's a song sung under a dim spotlight. And sometimes it's a whisper passed down through generations until one voice finally grows loud enough to break the silence. That photo didn't just capture death. It sparked a reckoning. It taught a country to look. And it's still speaking louder than ever. It happened again. Not in 1930, not in black and white, not on a postcard, but in 2020 on a smartphone, in full color, with a knee on a neck and the whole world watching. The video of George Floyd gasping for breath, whispering, "I can't breathe," until his voice was gone, didn't just shake America, it cracked it open. Because it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mirror. And for those who had seen the photograph of Marion, Indiana, it was something else entirely. It was déjà vu. Different century, same script, new uniform, same power. The day the George Floyd video went viral, people began sharing the photo of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith again, side by side, past and present, tree and concrete, nooses and knees. And underneath both, the same questions echoed. How did we get here? Why are we still here? On social media, the hashtag strange fruit trended. In protest marches from Minneapolis to Memphis, signs read, "This is not new. From trees to pavement, the photograph never left us." Because the truth was this, the photo never stopped repeating. It just changed forms. In downtown Brooklyn, a mural was painted on a brick wall, tall, bold, unflinching. On one side, the famous lynching photo from Marion, with the crowd looking right at you. On the other side, the frozen frame of Officer Derek Chauvin's knee pressed into Floyd's neck. Between them, in large red letters, America's timeline, unbroken. The mural became a gathering place. People left candles, notes, flowers. Children stood in silence. Some adults cried. Others just stared. One man, a Vietnam veteran, whispered, I fought in a war, came back, and realized the real fight was still here, still home. At a Black Lives Matter protest in Louisville, a young girl no older than 9 stood on the front line holding a cardboard sign. Her message? If I had lived in 1930, I hope I would have screamed. And under it, she had drawn the lynching photo in crayon. The crowd, the tree, the boys. But in her version, she had drawn herself in the photo, arms raised, mouth open wide, mid-scream. Because even a child knows, silence is the accomplice of history. Back in Marion, Indiana, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in nearly a century, the town held a memorial not for the lynchers, not for the mob, but for the 2 boys who never got a trial, never got a voice. At the base of the same tree, still standing, still silent residents, black and white, gathered in a circle. There were no speeches, no cameras, just names. Thomas Shipp, Abram Smith, and one more name, James Cameron, then a 4th, George Floyd. Because now their stories weren't separated by decades. They were bound, roots of the same poison tree. That day, an elderly woman in the crowd, Eleanor Hayes, stood and held up the original photograph. I was there, she said, voice firm but shaking. And I was silent. She looked at the children around her. Don't be me. Then she folded the photo, and this time she didn't hide it in a drawer. She placed it on the ground beneath the tree. Let the wind carry its edges. Let the truth rest where the lies once stood. Weeks later, a museum in Alabama launched a digital exhibit titled The Photo That Refused to Die. It began with Marion, then Atlanta, then Selma, then Watts, Rodney King, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor. It ended with a loop. The photo fades into the George Floyd footage. The rope becomes a knee. The tree becomes pavement. And the crowd remains, watching, filming, commenting. But will they do something? That's the question. One journalist asked, why do we keep needing a body to believe it happened? Why do we only listen when there's a photo or a video or a scream on tape? The answer, because the system hasn't changed, it's evolved. And the photograph, it never went away. It waits. It watches. It returns every time we forget. In a high school history class in Detroit, a teacher handed out both the Marion photo and a still from the Floyd video. She told the students, one is from 1930, one is from 2020. Can you tell me which is which without looking at the clothes? No one answered, because they couldn't, because it didn't matter, because the pose was the same, because the message was the same, because the value of a black life still somehow was negotiable. At the closing of the digital exhibit, a final message plays. This is not just history, it's warning. It's not just a photo, it's prophecy. Until justice is more than a caption, the photograph will keep coming back. And so here we are, scrolling, posting, outraged, heartbroken, Don. The image comes back because the truth never finished speaking. Because someone somewhere still doesn't believe it was that bad. Because someone always asks, but what did he do? But what was she wearing? But was he resisting? As if death needs permission. As if murder needs a footnote. So maybe the real question isn't, why does the photograph keep coming back? Maybe the real question is, what will we do when it does? Because history isn't just a loop, it's a test. And the grade depends on whether we finally look at the photograph not as a piece of the past, but as a reflection of the present. And then, maybe, just maybe, decide it will never be taken again. If this story shook something inside you, drop a number 1 in the comments to show you're not okay with the silence, the injustice, the way history keeps repeating itself. Speak up even with just a number because every voice matters. And remember this, when we ignore the past, we give it permission to return. Justice isn't just a courtroom. It's what we demand, what we teach, and what we refuse to forget.